We will begin our examination of how the mind forms a concept of God by looking at two quotes about God made by Paul Dirac, a famous physicist who is well known for his atheistic views. Dirac stated at a scientific conference in 1927 that, quote, "It is quite understandable why primitive people, who were so much more exposed to the overpowering forces of nature than we are today, should have personified these forces in fear and trembling." End quote. In other words, when people in primitive societies experienced the forces of nature, they concluded that the gods were responsible. For instance, most ancient cultures have the concept of a god of thunder who wields the lightning bolt as his weapon. Dirac adds that we no longer need these ancient concepts of deity because we now understand the natural processes that lie behind the forces of nature. Instead of appealing to gods, we can now appeal to science. However, in 1963, Dirac made a rather different statement. Quote, "It seems to be one of the fundamental features of nature that fundamental physical laws are described in terms of a mathematical theory of great beauty and power." End quote. Dirac is pointing out the beauty, elegance, and universality of the laws of nature. This led Dirac to postulate the existence of a god of mathematics who used advanced math to construct the universe. Thus, Dirac in 1927 gave the impression of being an atheist, while Dirac in 1963 talked about believing in God. I suggest that Dirac is actually talking about two different kinds of concepts of God, one based in experiences that are larger than life, and the other based in an understanding of universal law. One could refer to the first as gods written with a small g, and the second as one God, spelled with a capital G. In this presentation, we will refer to the first as a tribal God and the second as a universal God. As Dirac illustrates, I suggest that science naturally causes a person to doubt in the existence of tribal gods, but it also leads naturally to the concept of a universal God. This presentation will compare these two different concepts of God and discuss the tension that exists between these two in Judaism, Christianity, and modern secular society. Judaism began in a cultural environment of tribalism, in which every tribe had its own god, and these tribal gods were associated with physical objects that were worshipped and protected. One sees this illustrated by the Ark of the Covenant, supposedly the dwelling place of the Jewish God, which was housed first in a tent and then in the temple at Jerusalem. Israel regarded itself as a nation that was chosen by God. Similarly, each ancient culture viewed itself as a tribe connected with some tribal god living in some tribal homeland. But one finds a completely different concept of God described in the Jewish scriptures. That is because Judaism teaches the concept of a monotheistic God, a God associated not with a holy idol, but rather with a holy name, a God that is not just the God of the Jews, but rather the God of the entire universe. Instead of being driven by a tribal God to conquer other nations, the Jewish mandate was to be a light to the nations, sharing to other cultures the universal nature of God. Thus, one can see from the very beginning of Judaism an inherent struggle between the two concepts of God described by Dirac. On the one hand, God is viewed as the God of the Jews, a tribal deity who steps in to protect his chosen people. On the other hand, God is spoken of as a universal God who uses words to spread a message of universal understanding, just as science uses the words of mathematics to spread a message of universal understanding. This struggle lies at the heart of Judaism because one is uncertain whether the Jewish God is only a God of the Jews or whether he is the God of everyone. One can uncover this struggle by asking the typical Jew how God relates to Gentiles. One can see which of these two concepts of God is the wrong concept by looking at Jewish history. The Jews were convinced that God would never allow them to lose their land or their temple. But this happened twice, first in the exile into Babylon, and second in AD 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. Thus, if the Jews have been chosen by a real God who is in control of real history, then Jewish history makes it clear that this God is not a tribal God. However, both times when the temple was destroyed and the Jews were kicked out of the land of Israel, they fulfilled their mandate of being a light to the nations. During the Babylonian exile, Judaism was transformed from a tribal religion to a religion of the book, based in the synagogue and the keeping of Jewish law. Similarly, during the Middle Ages, the Jews were continually invited into different European lands and then expelled at a later time, as shown in this illustration. Wherever the Jews lived, they acted as a light to the nations, helping to civilize the local population through commerce and education. Thus, if one examines the history of Israel, one gains the strong impression that some universal being is using a chosen people to lead society beyond tribalism to the concept of a universal God. This struggle between a tribal God and a universal monotheistic God continues to exist in Judaism today. On the one hand, the entertainment industry, led primarily by Jews, has done more than almost anything else in modern society to encourage the average person to worship the idols and gods of Hollywood. Similarly, the banking industry, also dominated by Jews, feels strongly that it is a chosen people that deserves a special existence of wealth and prosperity. On the other hand, Jewish scientists have played a major role in exploring the concept of a universal God who rules over the universe, as indicated by the number of Jews that have won Nobel Prizes. In addition, modern Israel is a hotbed of high-tech companies. Concluding, both ancient Jewish history and the current behavior of Jews illustrates the inherent conflict between the concept of a tribal God and the message of monotheism. Judaism was followed by Christianity. It is interesting to view this transition in the light of these two concepts of God. The theologian N.T. Wright compares the thinking of Judaism with that of Christianity, and he concludes that, quote, one of the extraordinary achievements of Paul was to turn theology into a different kind of thing from what it had been before in the world, either of the Jews or of the pagans. In other words, theology plays a different role in Christianity than it does either in Judaism or in other religions. In simple terms, Paul invented Christian theology. Roman society regarded religion as an extension of the normal experiences of life. For the Greek and Roman mindset, nothing existed except tribal gods. Judaism preaches the concept of a monotheistic God, but it was held together by the rituals of the Jewish lifestyle. Christianity, in contrast, is held together by the glue of theology. Instead of filling daily existence with holy shrines and superhuman gods, as Roman citizens did, instead of being held together by a set of cultural practices that were regarded as holy, as Judaism is, Christianity regards a book as holy, and Paul taught that cultural and tribal divisions no longer exist within Christianity. Summarizing, while Judaism emerged in a context of tribal gods while teaching a God of monotheism, Christianity began with a foundation of monotheism held together by the words of a holy book. N.T. Wright adds that this theological foundation of Christianity was so novel that the average Roman citizen would have regarded Christianity more as a philosophy than as a religion. Turning now to the present, there is a new branch of science known as the cognitive science of religion, or CSR, which studies religion and belief in God from a cognitive perspective. Instead of asking whether God exists, it attempts to analyze how the mind forms a concept of God. One of the main findings of CSR involves the relationship between the two concepts of God that we are discussing. CSR says that the average person's explicit concept of God is not the same as their implicit concept of God. This conclusion is based upon a collection of experiments given to a number of groups from different countries and religions. When people are explicitly asked to describe the nature of God, they will typically describe a monotheistic, universal God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. In other words, they will describe the sort of God that is taught by Christian theology. However, if people are told stories about God interacting with people, then they will implicitly describe God as a sort of Superman who can only be in one place at a time and can only listen to one person at a time. In other words, while the average person explicitly talks about a theologically correct universal God, the average person also implicitly treats God as if he is a tribal deity limited by space and time. Thus, in the same way that Judaism preaches that there is one universal God, while often acting as if God is primarily the God of the Jews, so the typical modern individual says that there is one universal God, while implicitly treating God as a finite superhero, somewhat like the Greek gods. But that is not the whole story. If one steps back and examines CSR's approach to studying the concept of God, one also sees a distinction between explicit words and implicit beliefs. But it is a different distinction. On the one hand, CSR officially studies concepts of tribal gods that are based in religious rituals and cultural norms. CSR suggests that the mind contains what it calls an agency detector. For instance, if I hear an unknown noise in the middle of the night, then something in my mind will jump to the conclusion that some agent is responsible, such as a cat or a cat burglar. But what if something happens for which no obvious agent is responsible, such as a candle moving through the air? The agency detector will then jump to the conclusion that some invisible person is holding the candle. Similarly, if lightning strikes or a volcano erupts, then the agency detector will also conclude that some invisible agent is responsible, leading to the concept of a god of lightning or a volcano goddess. There is good evidence from both psychology and neurology to suggest that the mind does contain an agency detector. And the theory of mental symmetry uses the concept of mental networks to explain how the agency detector functions. The next presentation will look at mental networks. CSR studies religious experience and tribal concepts of God, but it avoids studying theology, and it regards the concept of a monotheistic God as a cognitively unnatural concept that is continually being overruled by people's implicit beliefs in supermen and tribal gods. For instance, Todd Tremlin says in the book Minds and Gods that, quote, Sometimes theology seems to do little more than provide soothing background noise. Even if this is an unnecessarily harsh characterization of theology's place in religious systems, at least it must be said that such notions are not the motor that drives religious ideas and the practices these ideas inform, nor does it play any significant role in the growth and decline of religious traditions." End quote. The official basis for CSR is the theory of evolution. In simple terms, CSR uses the myth of the fleeing native to explain the agency detector. Suppose that some proto-human heard a noise in the middle of the night. A proto-human with a working agency detector would jump to the conclusion that some wild animal was about to eat him, run away, and survive to pass on his genes, while proto-humans without a working agency detector would continue what they were doing, get eaten, and be unable to pass on their genes. This, according to CSR, explains why modern man has a working agency detector. Thus, CSR, which uses cognitive analysis to explicitly analyze myths, is itself explicitly based in a myth, because the story of the fleeing native is a conjecture that cannot be replicated through scientific analysis. However, if one examines how CSR implicitly treats God, then one comes up with a rather different conclusion. Because evolution is a general theory, it leads to the concept of nature with a capital N as an agent that is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-present. Nature is powerful enough to direct the entire course of the universe. Nature knows exactly which mutations are appropriate to produce an interacting ecosystem, and nature works on a timescale that is far longer than the lifespan of any individuals. In other words, nature actually corresponds to the implicit concept of a universal God. For instance, Todd Tremlin, who we quoted earlier, takes the first one quarter of his 2006 book to describe the theory of evolution, and Tremlin uses the word design about 50 times in his book to describe the work of evolution. Concluding, one sees in CSR a distinction between the kind of God that is explicitly being analyzed and the kind of God that is implicitly being described. But it is the opposite of what one notices in the typical person. The average person explicitly describes God as a universal being, while implicitly acting as if God is a finite Superman. CSR, in contrast, explicitly analyzes tribal concepts of God, but it implicitly teaches the concept of a universal God of nature working through the general theory of evolution. This implicit tendency to treat nature and the theory of evolution as a universal deity is not just limited to the field of CSR. For instance, David Henke, in a 2004 book entitled Explanations, describes the official explicit position of science regarding God. Quote, "It is no longer acceptable to think of biological objects as having any purpose because the overwhelming consensus of scientific opinion is that they were not designed and built by a creator." Henke points out that the explicit purpose of the theory of evolution is to come up with a general model of existence based in scientific mechanisms that does not require the concept of a divine agent. However, that does not describe the current situation. Instead, quote, "evolutionists lead the world in substituting teleology for objectivity. Instead of treating evolution as a general mechanism that functions objectively, evolutionists view natural selection as a great designer who is leading the universe towards the goal of ever-increasing order and structure." End quote. In other words, in the same way that studying the laws of nature led Dirac to postulate the existence of a universal God of mathematics, so studying the order and structure of biological life leads evolutionists to postulate the existence of a universal God of nature. However, this is an implicit concept of God that is seldom acknowledged explicitly. When a viewpoint such as intelligent design comes along that explicitly recognizes this implicit concept of God, then science explicitly rejects this concept of God, while continuing to treat nature implicitly as if it is a universal God of intelligent design. What is happening? When something occurs within the mind, despite one's best attempt to stop it from happening, then this is a strong indication that one is dealing with a cognitive mechanism, and that the structure of the mind is causing people to think and behave in certain ways. The basic premise of CSR is that one can explain religious belief in terms of cognitive mechanisms. There is strong evidence to support this premise. However, I suggest that one is actually dealing with two different cognitive mechanisms, one which CSR explicitly recognizes, and another which implicitly drives all branches of science. In simple terms, I suggest that the mind contains two detectors and not just one. The first detector is the agency detector, which jumps to the conclusion that agents are responsible for events. The agency detector is not rational, but rather emotional and hyperactive. It jumps to conclusions based upon incomplete data, and it is guided by gut feeling. For instance, when one is talking on the telephone, one cannot see the person with whom one is talking. Instead, one mentally jumps to the conclusion that one is talking with a person, and one finds it emotionally disconcerting when one reaches a menu system instead of a live person. Similarly, a doll is not alive, but when children play with dolls, they act as if these inanimate bundles of cloth and plastic are alive, telling us that something within the mind that develops very early in childhood naturally interprets experiences in personal terms. Adults do this as well. For instance, people have a natural tendency to yell at inanimate objects such as computers when they do not cooperate, treating objects as if they are persons, as well as interacting with these objects at an emotional level. Thus, concepts of gods with a small g can be viewed as the result of a misfiring agency detector. Emotional experiences are being interpreted in personal terms, and one then interacts with these mental concepts of invisible superhuman beings primarily at an emotional level. The second detector within the mind is a theory detector, which is also emotional and also hyperactive. This detector is illustrated by the metaphorical light that goes on above one's head when one gains an understanding. When the theory detector comes up with an explanation, then this leads to a positive emotion. Thomas Kuhn's book on paradigms and paradigm shifts describes many of the attributes of the theory detector. And Kuhn says that once a scientist acquires a paradigm, it becomes impossible for a scientist to exist without a paradigm. In the same way that primitive man was driven to use the agency detector to explain all events, so the modern scientist is driven to use the theory detector to explain all events. And this drive to find order and structure is not just limited to understanding the natural world. For instance, one also finds evidence for a theory detector within a bureaucracy, illustrated there by the cascading desks. As Oscar Wilde famously said, the bureaucracy is expanding to meet the needs of the expanding bureaucracy. In other words, there is an emotional drive within the human mind to form general structures as well as an emotional drive to expand these general structures once they have been formed. One can see both the hyperactive nature and the emotional drive of the theory detector in the conspiracy theorist, who jumps to the conclusion that some general theory or grand plan is driving the behavior of some group of people, and then defends his conspiracy theory with great emotional vigor. CSR says that concepts of tribal gods emerge when the agency detector misfires. I suggest that this is an accurate description. But I also suggest that the concept of a universal God naturally emerges when the theory detector discovers a universal structure and interprets this universal structure in personal terms. Even though CSR does not describe this theory detector, the behavior of CSR illustrates the presence of a theory detector. Saying this more generally, I suggest that a concept of God with a capital G forms when a sufficiently general theory touches personal identity. Science is built upon objective facts, and it tries to avoid subjective bias and personal identity. Therefore, the general theories of science lead implicitly to the concept of a universal God as expressed by nature in the theory of evolution. But this implicit concept of God is explicitly suppressed because science officially rejects the idea of personal agents. However, as CSR has discussed, the mind contains an agency detector that will naturally put a personal spin on experiences. If one examines society in general, one notices that it is being guided by two global trends that are related to the two concepts of God that we are discussing. On the one hand, there is a global trend towards spirituality without content. This implies that the agency detector in the average person is struggling to stay alive. In the past, the agency detector interpreted natural events in terms of personal agents and superhuman gods. However, science now uses the theory detector to explain all natural events, while doing its best to avoid triggering the agency detector because of its association with primitive concepts of tribal gods. The modern world of the 20th century has showed us what it is like to live in a society that is driven by objective science. Postmodern thought is now rebelling against the modern concept of being merely impersonal cogs in a cosmic machine. Saying this another way, the agency detector is now firing in desperation, insisting that agents do exist, that they must be recognized, and that there is more to personal existence than just objective scientific theory. Looking at this more specifically, when the average person on the street is asked about God and religion, he will respond that he is spiritual but not religious. Similarly, we saw that CSR studies religion while avoiding the topic of theology. There is also a general trend in religious circles to focus upon spiritual experience, while remaining skeptical of the very concept of theology and doctrinal dogma. There is also an interfaith movement, guided by the premise that all religions share a common urge to explore the spiritual and that theological differences can be ignored. One sees a similar trend in the emerging church, which tries to provide people with meaningful religious experiences while questioning traditional statements of theology. Finally, one finds even in religious circles that today's typical person is now theologically illiterate and knows very little about the content of religion. Western society is now so post-Christian that even the memory of Christian content has been lost. On the other hand, there is also a massive trend towards growing global order. We saw earlier how the order and structure of science leads to the implicit concept of a universal God known as nature. and I suggested that the concept of a universal God emerges whenever a sufficiently general theory applies to personal identity. Therefore, I suggest that growing global order and structure is in the process of creating a very potent implicit concept of a universal God. The most obvious example is the global economy. For instance, one can go to the produce section of the local grocery store and buy lettuce from California, mangoes from the Philippines, strawberries from Chile, pomegranates from Israel, and oranges from South Africa. Similarly, the Internet is composed of a network of interconnected computers located all around the world. For example, when I lived in Seoul, Korea, the language and culture was entirely different, but I accessed the same Internet as I do in Canada. Likewise, academia and professions have become globalized, making it possible to receive a similar education anywhere in the world and to work in the same profession in many countries. The global interconnections of the Internet and telecommunications also make it possible to spy on people universally. The more that we do online, the more it becomes possible for governments to know what we are doing and thinking. And the recent revelations of Edward Snowden have made it clear that governments are spying without limit upon the population. Christian children used to be told that they should be careful about what they think or do, because God sees and judges everything. Today, we are all becoming increasingly wary about what we do or think because we know that the government sees and judges everything. Finally, multinational corporations have now grown to the point where they are larger and more powerful than many sovereign countries, and agreements such as the TPP or Trans-Pacific Partnership are being used to transfer control from government to corporations. Looking at these two global trends more generally, the problem with the trend to empty spirituality is that it lacks internal content. A spiritual experience feels good, but like a friendly pat on the back, it lacks the substance that is required to solve personal problems. Similarly, the growing global infrastructure has transformed our physical world, and it provides us with many helpful gadgets and useful services, but it does not deal with the internal person. For many centuries, Asia was ruled by a combination of Buddhism and Confucianism. Buddhism provides spirituality without content, while Confucianism guides the external structure of society. These two acted as a sort of yin-yang, with each providing what the other lacked. We are in the process of returning to a similar sort of coexistence between empty spirituality and global order. The problem is that both of these components are inhuman. Humans are not just blobs of feelings, but rather combine personal emotions with personal content. Empty spirituality cannot address the personal feelings of the individual because it has no concept of individuality. Global order is also inhuman because it solves a person's physical needs while ignoring the personal feelings of the individual. A consumer society can provide a person with a continual flow of new toys, but it cannot give a person meaning. We looked earlier at the interplay between the concept of a tribal God and the concept of a monotheistic God within Jewish history. And we saw that Christianity replaced the concept of a holy nation with that of a holy book. I suggest that a similar interplay has occurred in Christianity between the concept of a God of the Bible and the concept of a universal God. Christianity is based in the concept of absolute truth. Notice in the illustration how the light from heaven shines directly upon the church, and how the steeple of the church acts as a beacon of light to the surrounding world. In a similar manner, Christians have historically viewed themselves as having an inside track to the absolute truth of God, which they then preach to the rest of the population. This absolute truth is contained within the holy book of the Bible. Thus, in the same way that Judaism combined the concept of a holy temple with a chosen nation, so Christianity combines the concept of a holy book with a chosen group of believers. But, just as Judaism teaches the concept of a monotheistic God which contradicts the concept of a chosen people and a holy temple, so the content of the Christian Bible is based upon theology, which uses universal truth and the concept of a universal God to bridge all cultures. I should emphasize that we are not looking here at whether or not Israel is chosen by God, or whether or not the Bible is the Word of God. Instead, we are examining how one interprets what it means for people to be chosen by God, or a book to be written by God. The Jews were supposed to be a light to the nations. Similarly, theology in the Middle Ages was regarded as the queen of sciences. I have come to the conclusion that Christian theology really is the queen of sciences if one interprets the Bible from a cognitive perspective. That is because all of the other disciplines use the human mind to study various areas, including aspects of human thought, but only Christian theology deals with the core issue of transforming how the mind works. Every book and every scientific paper that I have read so far, in every field that I have examined, is missing something about the core of human thought. These books and papers often contain a deep understanding of how the world works, or analyze with great accuracy peripheral aspects of how the mind works, but like a donut, I invariably find something missing in the middle. In contrast, when I read Jesus and Paul and the other biblical authors, I find this something in the middle being described and analyzed. Continuing with our parallel, Israel was convinced that their status as a chosen nation meant that the temple in Jerusalem would never be destroyed and that the Jews would never be kicked out of the land of Israel. Similarly, Christians are convinced that Christianity will never become ignored by the rest of society because Christians possess the Word of God. But we now live in a post-Christian world in which the cathedrals of Christianity are overshadowed by the skyscrapers of modern technology and commerce. However, in the same way that the Jews fulfilled their mandate of being a light to the nations when they migrated as a diaspora from one country to another, so Christianity fulfills its mandate of teaching universal truth to others best when it is forced by political persecution to be an illustration of universal truth and cannot use political power to impose absolute truth upon others. And in the same way that the struggle between a tribal concept of God and the message of monotheism continues to exist in modern-day Judaism, so there is a struggle in Christianity between absolute truth and universal truth. On the one hand, fundamentalism uses absolute truth to attack others, motivated by the certainty that I know what is true and you do not. But just as Jewish nationalism eventually led in Roman times to the destruction of Jerusalem and the expulsion of Jews from Jerusalem, so I suggest that fundamentalism is in the process of destroying the Christian message. On the other hand, just as the Jewish belief in monotheism helps Jews to discover and exploit the universal structure of the natural world, so I suggest that the universal truth of the Bible is leading many Christians to understand and practice universal principles of righteousness, based in an understanding of how the mind works. Jewish scientists and Israeli technology became predominant once Judaism was forced to leave its ghettos of religious tradition. Similarly, I suggest that a Christian understanding of righteousness will become evident when Christianity is forced to leave its intellectual ghetto of absolute truth. That is why I put a question mark after the term righteousness, and why the stairway into the clouds leads to an uncertain, yet bright, destination. We compared absolute truth with universal truth, and I have suggested that Christianity needs to move beyond absolute truth to a concept of universal truth. Let us look in more detail at how truth is defined. I suggest that one can distinguish between absolute truth, universal truth, and relative truth. This does not mean that three forms of truth actually exist, but rather that the human mind attempts to determine what is true in one of three primary ways. As we have seen, Christian absolute truth views the Bible as the sole source of truth. If it is in the Bible, then it is true. If it does not come from the Bible, then it is either suspect or false. Relative truth is a method of using consensus to find certainty when there are multiple sources of truth. The assumption of relative truth is that each cultural group has its own truth, and that one can find truth by having these various groups come to the table in order to have a conversation. Thus, an attitude of relative truth will tend to view the Bible as a conversation, and it will feel that the truth which the Bible is conveying depends upon the cultural group with which the Bible is conversing. Universal truth, in contrast, views the Bible as an accurate description of truth. Using an analogy, the law of gravity is not true because it is described by some physics textbook. Rather, the law of gravity exists, and a physics textbook is true because it accurately describes how the law of gravity functions. Similarly, I've come to the conclusion that the Bible is true because it accurately describes how the mind functions. When one believes that the truth has its source in the Bible, then there will be a strong motivation to preach this truth to others. After all, I know the truth, you do not. Therefore, I need to tell you the truth. Relative truth, in contrast, will believe strongly that one group should not judge the truth of another group. This prohibition against judging is one of the primary standards by which relative truth judges facts, and thus will take precedence over any content that is being proclaimed. For instance, during the recent Canadian elections, one American comedian said that Canadians should not vote for the Conservative Party because they told a Muslim lady that she should take off her niqab in order to show her face when swearing an oath of allegiance to become a Canadian citizen. The underlying issue of Muslim repression of women was deemed to be irrelevant. Instead, what matters was that the conservatives are judging Muslims. Because relative truth believes so strongly that it is wrong to judge others, relative truth will view absolute truth as a mortal enemy, because absolute truth believes that its mission is to preach truth to others. In contrast, because relative truth is based upon the status quo, it has no standard by which to evaluate or judge repressive cultures that are part of the status quo. For instance, relative truth will typically view Muslim repression of women as a natural part of Muslim culture that is an aspect of the status quo. Universal truth interacts with others in a manner that is different than either absolute truth or relative truth. Unlike absolute truth, it does not preach truth to others. But unlike relative truth, it believes that there are universal principles that are independent of culture. Therefore, an attitude of universal truth will point out truth to others when they encounter this truth. After all, if truth really is universal, then people will continually encounter it. And if truth is universal, then people will experience painful consequences when they violate these universal principles. As Churchill once said, quote, "Men occasionally stumble over the truth, but most of them pick themselves up and hurry off as if nothing ever happened." End quote. Universal truth helps people to recognize the truth when they do stumble over it, before they hurry off and forget what has happened. Moving on, absolute truth leads to a struggle between holy books. For instance, what makes the Bible a better source of truth than the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita? After all, they are all holy books. Relative truth leads to the strange predicament of worshiping other people's idols. If the bottom line is to refrain from judging and to respect culture, then one will end up implicitly honoring and serving the tribal gods of various cultures, because these have the greatest impact upon culture. This is currently happening in Western Europe, which is in the process of being overrun by the bigotry of Muslim culture. Notice that an attitude of relative truth will probably conclude that I have committed the sin of judging by verbally stating that Muslim culture is bigoted, even though we can all see the repression that occurs under Islam. Instead of viewing cultural behavior as undiscussable, universal truth uses logical and verbal analysis to search for universal principles that cross cultures and are independent of culture. Absolute truth preaches the truth of some culture. Relative truth preaches multiculturalism, while ending up being hijacked by the behavior and beliefs of strong cultures. Universal truth encourages cultural freedom within the framework of a rule of law that crosses culture. For instance, examining the case of the niqab, the anterior temporal lobes of the brain play a major role in social interaction, and there is a brain region within the anterior temporal lobes whose primary function is to recognize faces. Thus, when a woman covers her face so that only the eyes show, then this places a restriction on social interaction at a neurological level. Notice that this is a universal principle that is independent of culture or religion. Consistent with this, when one examines Muslim culture, one notices that many Muslim males have difficulty interacting socially with females. Continuing our comparison, absolute truth will attempt to impose its values upon the rest of society. And as I have mentioned, this will be viewed as an unforgivable sin by relative truth. However, relative truth leads eventually to amorality, because it rejects the very concept of a principle that applies to culture or rules over culture. Universal truth, in contrast, recognizes that truth is already being imposed inescapably upon everyone. In the same way that no one can escape the law of gravity, so everyone is already being judged by the structure of their mind. Thus, the challenge is to recognize truth and learn to live in a way that is consistent with this truth. We saw in the previous slide that science and technology have transformed the physical world, guided by an understanding of the universal laws of nature. Absolute truth will tend to view science as a godless evil. It is godless because it rejects the concept of absolute truth, and it is evil because it is using its godless theories to transform the world. Similarly, absolute truth will also reject universal truth as heretical. For instance, the theory of mental symmetry began with a list of 7 spiritual gifts in Romans 12, and it leads to a theology that is consistent with evangelical Christian theology. However, even though the content of my research is highly consistent with the content being preached by the evangelical Christian, I have repeatedly found that my research is rejected categorically by fundamentalist Christians because I do not teach that the Bible is the only source of absolute truth. Ironically, such a rejection occurs even when the topic of conversation is specifically Romans 12 spiritual gifts, the starting point for my cognitive model. Relative truth explicitly rejects absolute truth, but relative truth is also in the process of destroying scientific thought. Science began as a study of the universal truth of natural law, but science is now viewed primarily as a description of how a group of scientists behave. And the way that one behaves as a scientist is often regarded today as more important than what one discovers as a scientist. And what is discovered will often be ignored if it was not discovered in the proper manner by a proper group of scientists. Universal truth, in contrast, views science as an incomplete solution. Science has succeeded in discovering many universal truths about how the world functions. But what is the point of transforming the world if people remain savages? This merely results in smarter weapons, mass-produced worthless gadgets, and globally transmitted ignorance. Therefore, it is more important to discover universal truths about how the mind functions. But learning how the world works provides major clues that can help one to understand how the mind works. We will finish this presentation by returning to the original topic of two competing concepts of God. Primitive cultures and childish minds naturally form tribal concepts of God. History illustrates this, and the cognitive science of religion has demonstrated this experimentally. That is because the agency detector naturally functions within the childish and primitive minds. Science, in contrast, uses the theory detector, which leads implicitly within the mind of the scientist to the concept of a universal God. Similarly, modern technology is creating global structure that is leading to the implicit concept of a universal God within the mind of the average individual. Thus, science and technology are implicitly teaching the concept of a universal God that Judaism and Christianity officially teach, but implicitly tend to deny. However, the concept of a universal God that is emerging as a result of science and technology is an inhuman beast that has no place for humanity. Moving now to something new, as far as I can tell, the only solution is to explicitly present Christianity as a universal theory that includes the thinking of science and technology. And I present a possible solution in my latest book entitled Natural Cognitive Theology. This needs to be done not just to bring humanity back to the modern world, but also to save science itself from being deconstructed by the skepticism of relative truth. Therefore, I would like to look briefly at what it means to construct a concept of God that is based in a general theory that applies to personal identity. Before one can begin, one must address a question that has troubled theologians for millennia. In simple terms, how can fallible humans have any hope of understanding the nature of a universal God? How can the finite grasp the infinite? I suggest that the answer to this dilemma is described by a recent scientific paper entitled, quote, Parameter Space Compression Underlies Emergent Theories and Predictive Models, end quote. This paper says that it appears to be a general principle of nature that wherever one looks, at whatever scale, one consistently finds that natural behavior is guided primarily by a few parameters. Stated simply, wherever I look, it is always possible to gain an approximate understanding by focusing upon a few general principles. Obviously, it is impossible for finite individuals to learn everything about the infinite. But it is possible for finite individuals to learn key principles. And a knowledge of these key principles makes it possible to understand situations reasonably well. For instance, F equals ma is one of the key principles of high school physics. It can be used to analyze the movement of a car, the flight of a rocket, or even the path of a dog bouncing off the rear end of a person. Using F equals ma never gives an exact answer, because one is always ignoring or approximating lesser forces such as friction. However, it is possible to use F equals ma to consistently come up with answers that describe real situations with reasonable accuracy. In a similar manner, the Old Testament describes individuals applying names to God as they discover essential aspects of the character of God. None of these names encapsulate the entire essence of God, but they all describe aspects of an infinite being that make it possible for finite humans to gain a reasonably close understanding of the nature of a universal God. And in the same way that a simple equation such as F equals ma makes it possible to behave in a manner that is reasonably consistent with the universal laws of nature, so I suggest that understanding basic characteristics of the name of God makes it possible to behave in a manner that is reasonably consistent with the universal nature of God. Using an analogy, one could compare a concept of God with a monarch and subjects. The monarch is the general principle, such as F equals ma, or a name of God, such as Jehovah Shalom, while the subjects are the details that are added to this general principle. If one focuses only upon the general principles in a hand-waving manner while ignoring the details, this is like a monarch without subjects. Similarly, merely learning general principles about the character of God does not build the mental concept of a universal being. Going the other way, if one concludes that the situations of life are too complicated to be governed by any general principle, then that makes it impossible to construct a mental concept of God. This could be compared to a group of subjects without a monarch. For instance, I have read more than once in academic papers that personal identity is too complicated to be described or analyzed by any general principle. Another possible response is to say that I am pragmatic, and I live in a real world, and therefore do not need to be troubled by general theory. But saying that I am pragmatic is itself a general theory, because it is a general statement that is being used to summarize the essence of many specific situations. Cognitively speaking, the end result is an unmonarch, an empty throne that prevents other theories from sitting upon the throne. Today's specializations with their technical thought also discourage the building of a concept of God because they focus so much upon technical details that they lose the general picture. Finally, one must remember that a verbal theory is at best a description of universal laws. For instance, Einstein's equation E equals mc squared is only a set of verbal symbols. However, this verbal description made it possible to build the atomic bomb. In other words, theology is critical, but it is not enough. It is essential to build a mental concept of God, but the goal is not to remain an abstract doctrine, but rather to live within the transformed reality that a mental concept of God makes possible. Because today's knowledge is so technical and specialized, the general feeling is that one can only acquire an understanding by being a technical specialist with access to expensive laboratory equipment. For instance, multi-billion-dollar particle accelerators are now needed to study the structure of the physical universe. However, a concept of God emerges as a general theory applies to personal identity. In the parable of Newton and the apple, Newton conceived of the law of gravity because a normal apple from a normal tree fell on his head. Similarly, we can all understand more about how the mind works because we are all using our minds in normal life. One last principle. When one is attempting to gain an understanding of a universal being, it is important to remember that God is big and humans are not. One can illustrate this by comparing America with the city-state of Hong Kong. The United States is the world's most prosperous country with the world's largest army. Because the U.S. is so big, it is easy for Americans to confuse the country of America with a mental concept of God. However, as soon as one looks beyond the earth to the vastness of the universe, this feeling of bigness becomes rather laughable. Instead, finite humans need to adopt the attitude of smaller states such as Hong Kong, which cannot act big, but can become tiny microcosms of order, structure, and beauty. This is the first presentation in a series. For those who want more information, I have attempted to expand the theory of mental symmetry in 4 primary directions. First, as was already mentioned, mental symmetry can be used to present Christianity as a general cognitive theory leading to a systematic theology which includes a cognitive explanation for the Trinitarian concept of God. Second, mental symmetry is a cognitive meta-theory that provides the basis for a philosophy of science, as well as being consistent in detail with the latest neurology. Information regarding both Christian and secular theory can be found in the book Natural Cognitive Theology. Third, mental symmetry can be viewed from a pragmatic Christian perspective. The theory began with Romans 12 spiritual gifts, and it can be used to analyze the path that leads to personal transformation. Finally, the theory of mental symmetry has been applied to numerous topics involving language, culture, and identity, and papers have been presented at regional and national TESOL conferences. In addition, mental symmetry has also been used over the years to explain many principles of psychology. More information about the theory of mental symmetry can be found on the website www.mentalsymmetry.com. In addition, the book Natural Cognitive Theology is available on Amazon.com, both in hard copy and in Kindle version. Thank you for watching this video.